Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on leading the lost by Infopro Learning. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We know how it is these days where you're bouncing around from one meeting to the next with barely a second to grab food or drink or anything else. So we'll get started here in just a minute. Just bear with us here for a second. Um, and thanks again for joining early.
So Nolan, I'm thinking maybe we wait maybe one more minute and then we go.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, just give 1 minute left. I see some people
Mhm.
still joining and we'll get started. It seems like these days, I don't know if it's all, it definitely seems more these days that if you don't start 2 minutes late, it seems like you somehow started early. I don't know how that has worked. I don't know what I don't know if eventually we're just getting that much busier that's what's going to happen, but no.
The OCD part of me wants to start on time all the time
Yeah.
and also wants to end on time all the time or end 3 to 5 minutes early all the time. And I have been battling with that for years now, because it just seems like overwhelmingly, to your point, yeah, starting on time, it annoys some people because they feel like, wait a minute, 3 minutes, 3 minutes into the session, that's when you should start. So,
Yeah, well, we're officially in the session now. So thanks everybody for joining. Believe it or not, you didn't just join an internal meeting between Dan and I's musings. Thanks for joining our webinar on leading the loss, boosting engagement of employees who are restless and rewired. As somebody who started their day today at 5 a.m., I am squarely in this category. So I am looking forward to learn about this and excited for you to start. Some housekeeping things before I pass it over to my good friend Dan. You can utilize chat here. I just made a chat earlier. You can also do Q&A as you have questions, as you have feedback. You're welcome to do that. If you just want to react or do anything, there's also kind of an emoji here you can use. I'm just going to give one for a heart that says, I love all of you for joining this. Thank you for that. So feel free to use those things to kind of prod us and nudge us. I'll be interrupting Dan along the way with any of your questions or thoughts. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dan to lead us the rest of the way.
all right, thank you very much. So first, let's start off with a brief introduction. As you know, my name is Dan Rust. In terms of my background, for delivering this session, I've been in the corporate workplace workforce development space for over 30 years. I've worked for organizations like General Electric and other leading organizations. Currently, today, I work for Infopro Learning, which provides corporate training resources and in particular leadership development resources for a broad range of primarily Fortune 500 organizations. Also, a few years ago, I published a book through HarperCollins called Workplace Poker. And that book, the reason I'm sharing it with you is because when that book was published, it opened a door for me where I began to receive regular communications from people who had read the book and had particular workplace challenges that they wanted to discuss, that they had questions about or looking for guidance regarding. And so, I guess that happens when you publish a book that's focused on navigating workplace culture, navigating interpersonal dynamics in the workplace, and that has continued to this day. And so it helps me keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening in today's workforce, because not a week goes by where I don't get one or two messages from people who are, typically describing a particular scenario or situation that they're looking for guidance regarding. Um, And in addition, I am the host of the Leadership Disrupted podcast, where once a week we have a 1 hour conversation with someone who is someone who at least I consider to be an interesting thinker in the leadership development space. And then also, I host a podcast called Job Smack, which is essentially the podcast version of those workplace poker questions that I described earlier, where we talk through particular challenges that people are having in the workplace and what our guidance might be regarding those challenges. And I share all of that with you because, again, I just want to emphasize I spend my entire working time focused on issues and challenges that people are having in the workplace. If you want to follow me on social media, my handle is at Dan Rust on all social media except for Facebook, because on Facebook there is a Dan Rust who happens to sell insurance in Montana. So if you are looking for Montana insurance, definitely go to Facebook and look up at Dan Rust. Otherwise, on Facebook, you have to look up at dan.l.rust to find me. So with that, let's
Is
get
that where
started.
you
And we're going
is
to,
that where you keep your sourdough recipes? Is on Facebook?
well, I don't actually have a sourdough recipe, but anything equivalent to a sourdough recipe is yes, absolutely would keep that on Facebook. Um, and it's also where you might find my borderline inappropriate postings versus the hyper appropriate postings on LinkedIn. Um,
Great.
so I want to start with some research, and this research, as I said at the very beginning, my history in terms of workplace culture goes way back 3 decades. And starting in the early 2000s, I began tracking employee attitudes and perceptions in the workplace using a variety of surveys. So while I had my own survey called the Corporate Culture Map Survey, I was leveraging a lot of content from other surveys as well. And the content source has evolved over the years as more data becomes available. But I've been tracking particular elements of employee perception. And four that I want to share with you as we start here is number one, just general employee uncertainty, like uncertainty about their own job, uncertainty about themselves in the workplace, and employee cynicism. And there is a 20-year trend of continuous increasing of employee cynicism and uncertainty in the workplace. You can see the trend results on the screen here. At the same time, uh, assessing employee attitudes toward their leaders, like their perception of the engagement level of their leaders and their perception of the ethics of their leaders, that trend line over the course of 20 years, while there are some highs and lows, is trending consistently downwards. So we end up at a place today where employees, more so than ever before, are more uncertain, and their perceptions of their leaders are increasingly problematic, where they're perceiving their leaders as being less engaged, less ethical. Now, that may, not reflect on you. They may not be thinking that way specifically about you, but this general trend is absolutely undeniable. And so it leads one to the question, well, what is driving this? And so I have a thesis regarding what is driving this, and I will share that thesis with you over the course of the next couple of slides. Because if we're going to talk about leading the lost, what we really mean by that is leading those employees who are showing up for work. And oftentimes they're perceived as high performers, high contributors. But in fact, if we really if we view, employee engagement as gaining like maximum engagement of your employees, many of these employees are in fact lost to us, where they may only be bringing 80% or 50% of themselves to the workplace. And that's what I mean by leading the lost. I mean the vast sea of employees who appear to be happy, appear to be engaged, appear to be showing up on time, appear to be doing the job, but in fact under the surface, you're only getting 60%, 50%, maybe 30% of their actual capacity, their actual potential to contribute to the business. That's what I mean by the lost. And oftentimes, the research shows us that the employees who are most lost are your highest potential employees. They're employees who have the highest hopes, the highest desires, the highest ambitions, the highest ability to contribute, but they're also the easiest to lose because they do have higher standards. So what we're going to be talking about today is how do you regain those lost employees? They're still with you, they're still showing up, they're still contributing, but you may not realize how much of what they could contribute is being left on the table. And so let's get to my thesis. It starts with the workplace has become more and more and more diverse in terms of actual, the employees who are showing up for work over the last 30 years. You can go back to the 70s or 80s, and we were talking about globalization back then. But the employees we are working with today are so varied. And it's not just cultural variance. It's not just language variance. It's not just geographic variance. There are just so many elements of difference in the workplace today. There is neurodiversity, family diversity, military diversity, economic diversity, all of the diversities. And so I think there was a time when employees felt compelled to fit themselves into the box or the mold that the workplace expected of them. And over the last few decades, that imperative to fit the mold, to fit the corporate mold, has gotten less and less imperative. And so employees are feeling much more comfortable showing up authentically, showing up for work as who they are, thinking the way they think, living the way they live, expressing the culture that they're from. So we end up, instead of having an army of employees in blue blazers and khaki slacks, we have an army of employees who are very diverse, very different. And that's only one of the factors that are leading to this challenging culture within the workplace. And it's not that diversity is a challenge, it's that diversity just makes it that much more complicated. Not everyone is fitting into a single mold. So that's just one of many factors. Secondly, think about the amount of information that's coming at you, that's coming at your employees every single day. I'm of an age where I can remember back to the 80s and 90s, and I can remember feeling like, man, we're being overwhelmed or inundated with information, but it was nothing compared to the way things are today. Through social media, through news media, through business media, through entertainment media, over and over, we through Teams messages, through chats, through emails, we are being inundated with data, with information, and many people are, without even realizing it, are experiencing a level of cognitive overload almost on a daily basis. Again, just one of many factors that are contributing to this level of employee apathy or disengagement. Also, misinformation. We can't ignore the reality that while we're experiencing information overload, we're also experiencing disinformation or misinformation overload to the point where we aren't sure who we can believe. We aren't sure what we can believe. It is, again, it does impact our overall culture, not only in our world, but it does in fact impact our corporate culture. Not that the corporate culture is necessarily spreading disinformation, but that sense of you don't know who you can trust. You don't know what you can trust. You don't know what information is real. It does contribute to this sense of employee disengagement. Add to that the increasing pace and complexity of work. The workplace is moving faster. There's more happening. There's more in terms of complex systems, complex processes. I remember what it was like to onboard new employees in the 90s. Today, when we're onboarding new employees, there's just so much more to onboard in terms of systemic complexity, process complexity, role complexity. That's impacting employee engagement. AI, you can't minimize the impact of AI on employee engagement or disengagement and general employee challenges in the workplace. So it's different for different organizations, but AI is having a huge impact. In addition to AI, there is this sense, and some of you may share this, some of you may not share this. There's this sense that the world isn't working as well or as smoothly or as seamlessly as it used to work. Like the gears of the world just are grinding down. Do you find yourself wondering, is it me or is the world just not working the way it used to work or the way it's supposed to work? The world itself is more challenging. And when it feels like the world is more challenging, of course, that impacts employees and their level of engagement in their workplace. Now, along with that more challenging sense of, is the world, is it really working? There is this growing sense of, well, it's working for some. Some are doing great. Social media contributes to this. If you go, if you spend too much time on Instagram or TikTok or other social media, you can easily get the sense that, wow, I must be the only one who's really struggling with the way things are because everyone else seems to have 8% body fat. Every other person is driving a Bugatti. Everyone else is going on fabulous vacations. Everyone else is having a great time with their life, and yet I seem to be struggling. Also, just the sense of economic disparity and this feeling of haves and have-nots, winners and losers. It is a growing sense among workers, broadly speaking, in the world. And it does contribute to this sense of disengagement, this sense of needing to set boundaries in terms of my contributions to the workplace because the results or the rewards of all of this work are being unevenly distributed back in the opposite direction. In addition, a couple of other factors. Our overall approach to food, our food systemically, is very industrial now, and you have a lot of employees who are not eating as well as they might have been eating in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Particularly, again, when you're under the burden of a heavy workload, a heavy work demands, yeah, your diet tends to suffer. And we can't ignore that this does have an impact on our overall level of engagement in the workplace. And it's not just food, it's also medicine. I was just reading this morning. I pulled up some of the most recent research. We have the most medicated workforce ever. And we're talking primarily, when I say medicated, I'm talking about ADHD medications, anxiety medications, medications that help us focus, medications that help us maintain our level of energy, medications that address whether it's chronic anxiety or whatever it might be addressing. We have a very heavily medicated workforce, not just in the West, but this is broadly, globally speaking. And so when we ask ourselves, why are employees not as engaged as they used to be? Why are they not as happy as they used to be? Why are they more cynical than ever? Why are they more doubtful than ever? Why do they look at leaders with a bit of a jaded eye more so than ever? All of these factors that I've been mentioning, I think, do contribute, including the advent of more remote work than ever before. Of course, the pandemic, drove many of us to work from home, and then many people have been brought back to their office or their physical locations, but there's still a fair number of remote workers who have physically separated themselves from the core of their organizations. And when you've got a remote workforce, again, that impacts the level of employee engagement. It requires more from leaders to pull those employees in and to keep them engaged. And sometimes leaders don't necessarily sense all of this. So if what I've been sharing with you feels like I'm dumping a big load of information, and maybe it feels overly cynical, overly doubtful, overly harsh. First of all, I go back to the research. The research tells us employees are less engaged than ever before. They're more doubtful, they're more cynical, and you may have a different thesis. But this is my thesis in terms of what is driving this level of disengagement. Plus, what I see is many leaders, not all, maybe none of you that are on this webinar, but many leaders are somewhat insulated from a lot of these factors because as the higher you move up the leadership hierarchy, the more control you have over your work environment. So you may not perceive a lot of these things that are happening around you, or perhaps you do. But that separation, that bubble that you may be living in as a leader, actually that itself also drives employee disengagement because they recognize when you are disconnected from their reality, when it seems like you are giving guidance or leadership or coaching and your employees perceive that you don't live in the same reality that they live in, you don't see things the way they see them, you don't understand their world of work, that also drives employee disengagement. So
So,
let me ask you, so go ahead,
just a question,
Nolan.
Dan, as a non-Bugatti, overweight, wars ending guy, is the research showing that those things exist? Obviously, I don't know where you'd have to live to not think they exist, but like, is the thought that, or is the statement that it's at an all-time high, or like, are those, have we, or has it just been something else instead of those things?
Well, of course, I'm using Bugattis and body fat percentage as hyperbolic
Right.
extremes. In a general sense, the sense that we get from social media is that
Yeah.
other people are okay. Other
No,
people are
I
doing
mean,
well.
I mean all these other things. Like, so, like, are we at one of the most volatile business environment? Because you mentioned so many different
Yeah,
factors. Like, and you've been obviously leading organizations for 20, 30 years, so you've been through all the different things. What is your thought on that? Like, is it the most noise we've ever had? Is it similar?
I think it's a perfect storm. What
Okay.
is unique is this convergence. Although I do think faster, more complexity, absolutely more than ever. AI, of course, more than ever. So for some of these, medication, absolutely, the research says our
Right.
workforce is
Yeah.
more medicated than ever. So I could make the case that many of these things are in fact worse than ever. But even if they're not worse than ever, there's this convergence, this perfect storm of all of these factors that
Right.
in fact creates a perception that it's never been like this. And generally speaking, and I'm and I might I used to say as I was covering this for some groups that it's primarily the younger generations in the workforce, but that's not true anymore. It isn't. So in my conversations and even the research, even even baby boomers who might have in the past been your stalwarts. They might in the past have been the generation that would say, you know what, I was taught just to keep my head down, just to do the work. And what that generation is finding is they also are experiencing the perception of,
Mm.
unfairness, the perception of unequal distribution of the rewards. And in a general sense, again, this isn't true of everybody. I mean, this is, we have people who are quite happy, quite satisfied in their world of work. But if you look at the trends are trending toward less satisfaction and unhappiness, particularly in the workplace. I would love in the chat if any of you have any thoughts or ideas about what else is amplifying unhappiness, either in our world, unhappiness in our workplace. One of the things that has changed it, from my perception is that it used to be you could focus on corporate culture and you could just say, we're going to work on our corporate culture. And that was its own distinct thing from social culture, from societal culture, from big picture world culture. And I think those distinctions have gotten more and more fuzzy or muddy, where the broader world culture, the broader social culture, more and more is impacting your corporate culture. So you can't, when an employee is having a certain sense of the world and they come into the workplace, they don't just set that part of their brain aside. That part of their brain comes with them. And so that level of dissatisfaction, that level of agitation, that level of rewiring comes with those employees into the workplace. And I think we're reaching a point where we can't ignore. It's not enough to say, look, all right, can't do anything about all of that. So let's just focus on OKRs. Let's just focus on your specific projects. Let's just focus on the work. Keep your head down, focus on the work, and assume the rest of it will work itself out. It's not working itself out. Now, what I don't want to do is have people get all gloomy and doomy and depressed, because there is hopefully a way to move from crisis to clarity. And in fact, that's what we're going to talk about right now, because there is a way to go from all of this to a sense of hope, a sense of engagement. In fact, this is how we want to help our employees come to the workplace with a sense of optimism and hope. Not that we want them to ignore all of the other things that are happening, but there is a way. And so we're gonna talk through that. And we even have one of our corporate training programs at Infopro Learning is called Cracking the Engagement Code. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you right now comes from that program, Cracking the Engagement Code, because we talked about surveys of employee attitudes. Along with those surveys, when employees are asked, well, what are you looking for? What would it take to drive engagement? What are you hoping for from your leaders? The good news is they tell us. So there is no mystery about what it takes to drive engagement. And I'll share with you some of the unmysterious answers that employees are giving us. The challenge can be there's no mystery, but the answers may not always be the answers that we were hoping to hear. The first is embracing the brutal reality, meaning it's important if there are weeds in your garden to see the weeds in your garden. You're not going to pull weeds out unless you actually see the weeds. And so if your employees perceive you as being like a happy cheerleader and not necessarily seeing the weeds in the garden, if they see you as a leader in a bubble, that actually works against employee engagement. So it's important to be the kind of leader who sees the world that employees see. If you work in an organization that is particularly internally complicated to work with, or particularly internally frustrating for whatever the frustrations might be, whatever the realities in the workplace are, it's important, even if you can't necessarily fix all of the issues, whatever they might be, it's important that employees see that you see that reality. Because if they feel like you are just a hyper cheerleader, it's going to feel to them like we're on the Titanic and the captain doesn't see the icebergs ahead. They want to know now whether you can fix it or not, whether you're making an effort or not. They want to know that you have the same sense of reality that they have. The other thing we would suggest that you do is look for opportunities to simplify, to streamline, to cut through some of the complexity. Because as we mentioned, employees are experiencing cognitive overload. They are experiencing overwhelm. And so when I say simplify, what I really mean is ask yourself about every meeting. Do these meetings need to occur? Does this communication need to occur? Where are we overcomplicating things, or where are we retaining complications that no longer serve a purpose? Oftentimes we have a legacy of complications in our business that we either wait or suddenly someone new comes along who starts looking at things through a different set of eyes, and they actually can help us simplify our business overall. So I don't know what that answer is for any of you individually, but I would say helping yourself and your organizations simplify. Rachel, I see your comment here. Learn more about psychological safety recently. really important that leaders show their own vulnerability in order to build that trust with their people so they're seen as humans who they can speak openly with, as staying silent increases risk. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so thank you for sharing that. Now, when it comes to simplification, we also have to avoid oversimplification. And so now there's a duality to that because we're saying simplify, but be cautious about oversimplifying because we do live and work in a complex world. And so as leaders, we have to embrace the complexity and leverage what we call, or I call, integrated thinking. And what I mean by integrated thinking is actually integrating strategic thinking, critical thinking, and systems thinking. And we could probably spend 2 hours on how to do this, but taking those three modes of thinking and applying those to your business processes, applying that to your business overall, almost putting three different thinking caps on, three different minds on as you analyze your business and think more deeply. My sense of it is that we have many leaders who learned a certain way of thinking decades ago. They learned a certain way of being decades ago. They had a certain leadership playbook from decades ago, and that playbook just isn't producing the results that it used to produce. So rethinking your entire leadership playbook is something that I would absolutely recommend that you start to do by applying deeper thinking almost to every aspect of your business. And then letting your employees know and actually pulling them into the dialogue, pulling them into the conversation. One of my favorite questions when I have one-on-one, whether it's a performance review or just a regularly scheduled one-on-one, I now today regularly will ask my employees, what am I not seeing that you are seeing in the business? I'm asking them to address my blind spots. Now, it requires psychological safety. To your point, Rachel, you have to develop the kind of relationship where when you ask, your employees are comfortable saying, well, you might not be seeing this, or you might not be understanding this. But it is important that leaders are regularly checking in with their direct reports and going down one level, two levels, three levels down to try to ensure that you understand how work is working in your workplace. So back to starting with you. Um, because most of the research tells us that the key to employee engagement is leadership engagement. I hate to say it. I would love to be able to tell you it's actually fresh water in the cafeteria refrigerator. It's actually sunlight. It's actually a better reward and recognition program for your employees. It's actually those are all great. I'm not saying anything against any of those things, but they do not move the needle when it comes to actual employee engagement. What moves the needle are leaders. And so when it comes to starting with you, my next point here is to have empathy for others and accept that there are multiple perspectives on almost every issue, challenge. And so when you have employees who are facing all the challenges that we covered at the very beginning, understanding that each employee is going to interpret those things differently, is going to experience them differently, is going to react to those things differently, and that there really isn't one way of being any longer. If you grew up in the 60s or 70s or 80s or even 90s, leadership tended to be, when people talked about leadership, they would talk about a leadership model. Leadership was these things applied this way. I think it's more complicated than that today. In fact, if I were to ask you, as a leader, should you be optimistic or should you be cynical, confident and certain of yourself, or more humble, more doubtful? Should you be a driver or should you be collaborative? And of course, the answer to these questions is going to be, well, sometimes this and sometimes that. There is a duality to all of this. Sometimes it's important for a leader to be very approachable, but I think there are other times where it's important for a leader to have a certain presence that might be intimidating to some people, but that strong leadership presence is going to be important at times. Sometimes be data driven, sometimes be people and culture oriented. So we live in a world where being comfortable with that duality, being comfortable with not a single model being applied, and then being able to navigate uh, effectively what kind of leader do they need? What kind of leadership do they need from me now? What kind of leadership does this situation, this organization, this particular set of circumstances, what kind of leadership is required now? And having the ability, the willingness to flex. I just spoke with a venture capital firm a couple of weeks ago. And the venture capital firm, when they are looking at founders to potentially invest in, they actually have an assessment that they take those founders through. And it's a very intricate and subtle assessment because they're not looking for any one of the things that you see on the screen here. They're looking for all of those things, but mostly they're looking for flexibility. They're looking for founders who have the ability to meet the moment and to be the kind of leader that is needed in that moment, whether it's that moment with those people, that moment with those circumstances, that moment with whatever might be happening. So having that degree of flexibility is one of the core characteristics that they're looking for from even the founders that they're willing to invest in. What last point about that? So I asked them what led them to that model, and they said, well, actually, increasingly, they have found that when they invest in leaders or founders who may have a strong track record, but if that strong track record leads them to being non-flexible, to say, hey, here's what I am, this is what produces results, that lack of flexibility, they've actually found to be a high risk for investing further in that founder. They're looking for that both intellectual and emotional flexibility, mindset flexibility from the founders that they're willing to invest time in. So back to as a reminder, we started by showing you this screen. So all of this, while it can start to sound like a bit of a rant, the reality is all of this is research-based, it's data-based, and we can't avoid the fact that we're losing the full engagement of many of our high-performing employees. And in fact, some of our highest performing employees, where we might be thinking, well, that person must be fully engaged because he's one of our strongest contributors or she's one of our strongest contributors. In fact, much of the data tells us your strongest contributors are the least engaged. They just learned they are so capable that they're able to give you what appears to be 100% while only giving you 30% or 40%. They are basically able to give more than most of your other employees while still remaining to a large degree checked out. And so how do you earn back that engagement? Imagine what it would be like if you could take your highest performing employees and actually, instead of getting 30 or 40%, actually get 70, 80, or 90% of their potential for contributing in the workplace. And answering that question is actually what informed the development of, I mentioned it earlier, this program called Cracking the Engagement Code. And this particular program, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes going through some of the recommendations from Cracking the Engagement Code. And the essential question we were asking is, what will it take or what does it take to re-earn the engagement of our highest performing employees? And we identified 10 particular factors that lead to a high engagement environment, particularly for, again, high performing employees. And I know I said this before, it all starts with engaged leadership. And engaged leadership as perceived by those high performing employees. So I'm going to ask you in the chat, if I were to ask you, what would you imagine most employees are asking for that their leaders are not giving them? Now, they may actually be asking, they may not be asking it at all, but there is one factor more than anything else that contributes to employee perception of leadership engagement. I know it's a horribly vague question, but I'm going to ask if anybody in the chat can share what they might perceive as being, what do employees want from their leaders more than anything else?
Well, well, maybe somebody else answers. I think it's got to be time. I don't know, maybe just because I feel
Are
like that's the most precious resource that I have as a manager, and it's what I feel the worst about. Like, I feel the most pressure on my time, and there's just no way I can give it back. Oh, no way. Did I get it right?
it's yes, and now we have to say to people, this was not planned. You have not
No,
seen this deck before.
no, I
Um,
swear. Yeah.
it is absolutely true.
Okay.
What employees yearn for. Now, they won't always say because your high performing employees, in fact, will oftentimes feign independence. They will say, "Look, just leave me alone. Don't micromanage
Yeah.
me." And then all that does is that feeds into leaders feeling okay, like he doesn't want to be micromanaged. So you know what? If I happen to miss my biweekly one-on-one with him or my monthly one-on-one with him, um, I was going through some data just this morning, Nolan, and for example, 2 decades ago, the average leader had weekly one-on-ones with every direct report. Then it shifted about a decade ago. It shifted to biweekly one-on-ones. Now some leaders still do biweekly one-on-ones, and some still do weekly one-on-ones, but monthly one-on-ones have become more common. But what we find happening is that those weekly one-on-ones almost never make it up the priority hierarchy. In other words,
Yeah.
if I'm a leader and I've got a biweekly one-on-one, um, and in the pressure of time, I need to find something to cancel. It's like the one-on-ones are the first things to cancel. They're the first things to bump. Or you'll send a Teams message saying, "Hey, if you have anything critical, let me know. But otherwise, let's cancel this week's meeting because we're going to move on to other things, whatever they are." And unless the employee emails you with something critical, you don't feel too bad about missing that one-on-one. But in fact, the actual one-on-one scheduled time is reducing significantly, particularly in the last decade. But what also contributes to that, Nolan, is the number of direct reports.
Yeah.
Go back 20 years ago, and it was classic management theory. A manager should have no more than 6 to 8 direct reports. Classic, McKinsey management theory, other folks' management theories, and senior leaders have managed up until about 10 years ago. Senior leaders managed to maintain that ratio, but mid-level and junior leaders were not able to maintain that ratio. They didn't have the power to maintain that ratio. So you might be a junior manager or supervisor or a mid-level leader, and company decides to lay a manager off, and instead of hiring a new manager, they take those direct reports and they spread them around some of the other managers. And we just saw year after year that the ratio, the span of control for mid-level managers and supervisory level managers got higher, higher, and higher. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but definitely an increasing ratio, which again uh, impacts the amount of time that you can give. And up until about a decade ago, at the senior levels, though, they were able to maintain their ratios. But now what we've seen in the last 10 years is that even at the senior levels, you're seeing 10 direct reports, 12 direct reports,
Yeah.
14 direct reports. And so, how can any human being not only meet regularly, but then how can you make those meetings substantively of good quality, substantively quality enough where the employee feels seen, feels heard, feels responded to, and
Well,
so go
you
ahead.
see, you do. For those that don't know, Dan also is very good at sales strategy, sales leadership strategy, and sales training. And one of the things that we see when there's these sales conferences, there's so much thought around like what should we be training people on, what should we be doing. When end of the day, what the salespeople value the most is just spending time with their boss because it's so rare that they get time with their boss. And those companies that are fortunate enough to still have, an offsite kickoff or whatever it is, they're getting 2 days with their boss, who they usually get for 30 minutes. And so this is not just evidenced in like the tail end, but we also see that when it is given, when there is enough time, Peter, you said quality time, right? Going out for a drink or doing whatever, just sitting next to them, we see the engagement score start to spike.
And particularly if you have that kind of time and nobody mentions OKRs.
Yeah,
Nobody
yeah,
mentions,
yeah,
hey, how do we problem solve that project? Nobody mentions, hey, you know what? Our metrics are a little down this month. Let's problem solve. Let's brainstorm. Now, those tend to be the comfort zones for managers. So they tend to like lean into let's problem solve. Let's address whatever is not going great because again, that's the natural way we as managers index. But what employees are hoping or yearning to hear from us is tell me how things are going with you. Tell
hmm
me, how am I doing as a leader for you? And now, if you ask a question like that, be prepared for the first answer to be, "Oh, you're fine. No worries. You're great. You stay out of my hair. You're doing great."
yeah,
Ask that question regularly, at least once a month for 6 months. You'll eventually get closer to the reality where if you create a bit of psychological safety, if you create a sense of comfort so that you can ask your employees, how can I create more value for you as a leader? How am I showing up in the workplace for you as a leader? I'm looking for areas to sharpen my saw, so to speak. What would you suggest for me as your leader? You have to ask again and again and again. And eventually you peel the layers away and then you start to get to the reality. And I know this both from personal experience and I just know this from anecdotal
yeah,
conversations with other
and
leaders.
yeah,
I had someone say to me, Dan, the truth is, if you could just show up for every meeting on time, just that alone. If
yeah,
we knew it, and if you aren't going to be able to make a meeting, if we could know a day or two in advance, that would be great as well. She said just that alone would help. But it took me 3 months to get to that answer. Because there was a discomfort with saying, oh, because Dan's so busy, there's always stuff going on, and then I I needed to hear that though because what it told me was these things are getting noticed, whether I recognize it or not. If I've developed a pattern where I always show up 3 to 5 minutes late, or I cancel 4 minutes before a meeting starts, or I just say, "Hey, 4 minutes before a meeting starts, hey, today's gotten really crazy. I'm not going to be able to make this particular meeting." Um, Maybe this is too much self-disclosure, but I had a particular team that I perceived as a high-performing team. They're doing great on their own. And if I happen to miss like the once weekly team meeting where we weren't going to discuss necessarily particular projects, I I underestimated the impact that missing those meetings had on that particular team. Because what they were yearning for, to your earlier point, Nolan, was time. And I am consciously spending a lot of time on this. There are lots of things we could go through, but I will tell you, all of these pale in comparison to finding quality time with each of your team
but
members.
how do you do that? Like,
Well, here's where you start. You start by
okay,
deciding. You
okay,
decide that's the
okay,
priority, and then you work everything else around that.
okay.
Now, I know those are easy words to say, but this is what I've seen work in the real world is you make a decision. You decide this is important. And so I am going to lock in my one-on-ones. I'm going to lock in my time. I'm going to make sure. I mean, if I were to ask you about any of your direct reports and ask you, do you know what that person's kind of life ambitions are? Like going forward, like what's the next phase in their life? What's the next stage in their life? And I don't mean something simple like, well, she's a level one manager and she wants to be a level two manager. I mean, what are her ambitions for her life? What does she really enjoy doing? What would she like to have happen in the next 3 to 5 years? Most of us might be able to guess, or we might be able to imagine, but in terms of actually knowing what's happening with that person, if I asked you, How many children do they have? What are their children's names? What's going on with their children? I mean, we know these things about our friends, some of them. We know these things about other family members. But if you want your employees to feel seen, then you have to see them. And in order to see them, you have to take the time to see them. And so I'm going to back up for a second. You cannot look at this graph and then just lament and say, "Oh my God, what do we do about that?"
Hmm.
Well, what we do about that is we spend time with our employees. We spend quality time with our employees. And I'm going to move on to what's next, but I just want to see if there is, are there any commentary regarding this focus on time?
Well,
Anything
there
any
was
of you
one
want to
other one
share?
that Sergio put forth, which was like, what about clear direction and being on the same page, consistent? I think consistent communication is probably that, but I don't know if you're planning to talk about, but I have heard, the clear direction, being on the same page is critical because when everybody feels, in the title, leading through the lost,
Yeah,
a direction is a place to go. It's being found. It's this is where we're
absolutely.
heading.
And if you look at the yellow engaged leadership thing, and then go up to the up, go over to the right and then up, where we have clear objectives and expectations, it absolutely is. It absolutely is important in helping people to be engaged. But in the absence of time, it's just, hey, I'm clearly communicating with you. I sent you that email. I sent our list of OKRs, or I sent, like, we can feel really good about clear objectives and clear communication. And if we're not investing the time, it feels hollow. So I'm not minimizing the importance of clear objectives and expectations. But what I have found in the real world is we get very excited about some of these other things because they feel executable. I can do that. I can do those things. But in the absence of, let me ask you about your kids. You know what? You can lay out the perfect life strategy. You can set clear objectives and expectations for your children. And what they want is time. What they want is
Mm.
your engagement. And so if you can remember a time when you have taken the time to consciously invest extra time with an employee, um, if anyone wants to share anything in the chat, you are welcome to. I'm going to share one example, um, but I'm only going to share that if I don't see anything coming up in the chat. Um, so the example I'm going to share is I had a very high performer who told me over and over again, just, you know what, let me do my thing. Just let me. I hired her because she was a hard charging, driven, dynamic person. Didn't seem to be very needy, and she actually said, "I'm not very needy. I need clear expectations. Give me a goal. Give me the resources, and let me go for it." So fine, gave her the goal and let her go for it, which is great. And this she was in a sales position. That's fantastic. Until 2.5 years later, I lost her. I lost her.
Mm.
She went on to work somewhere else, and I circled back with her to have a debrief conversation. I wanted to know why did, and she said initially when she turned in her resignation, she said, "It's not you. It's not you. It's just me, and my life is heading in a different direction. I need other things out of work." And but you're fine. You're fantastic. I just need more. I need different. And now, to her credit, she was willing to talk with me. She had already moved on. There's no way to get her back. So we had a conversation. And I said to her, "Well, what did you move on to?" And then she started to describe some of the things that her new employer was giving her in terms of growth, in terms
Mm.
of support for her own education, in terms of a few other things, some flexibility because she just had her second child and she needed a little more flexibility. And as she was describing all of this, I had this sinking feeling like I could have done all of this. I absolutely could have done all of the things that she was describing, but I didn't actually even know that she'd had a second child.
Mm.
I had no clue. I realized at that point, even though she'd given me all the permissions needed to basically just let her run, She
Yeah.
needed more. She needed different from me. And so I, as the leader, needed to not just see what was directly in front of me, but see kind of around the corner. Like what is there that is not obvious, and take the time to see her at a deeper level. And so instead, what she did was she started searching around, and because she was a high performer, she very quickly found an employer who was absolutely willing to do all of those things. And also, she was able to have those conversations with that employer.
Yeah.
Um, Reaction, Nolan? There's,
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that that doesn't happen to me.
yeah.
You know,
And
one of the things I can't, you know, I have realized that um, I have certain blind spots, and I think, you know, there used to be a course a couple years back that was pretty popular on, you know, what was it, unconscious bias. Kind of fell by the wayside with
Mhm.
some other things, but uh, I I'm a strong believer that like if you and it's hard, it's one of those things that's hard to understand what your bias is, but once I was able to kind of understand that I am going to bias towards people wanting to talk about work. Like when I'm talking about work,
Mhm.
that's what they want to talk about. And like because they're not overly chatty, and so this just must be what it is. And I myself don't like to really do, I'm not that kind of person. So although it is painful when somebody messages me and I say, hey, and I'm like hoping to write, you know, hey, and then I'm just letting them say hi back so that I can then ask my
Mhm.
business question. When they say, hey, and they'll say, hey, what's up? I don't just start with what I want. I
Mhm.
say, like, you know, oh, no, you know, not much, just having a good day. What's going on in your life? And so I have realized that what people want from me is not always what I would want from myself. So like I definitely hear you that like I would have assumed they wanted that, and that's probably not something I want. So I have to make a conscious effort to be what that person probably wants me to be.
And it's going to be different with every employee.
Yes.
So some of your employees are going to want much more of that. Some, like myself, for example, I I want people to get to the point, but that doesn't mean just because they get to the point that we eliminate all of the interpersonal stuff. There's just a way, like if someone reaches out to me and I know they're reaching out because they need something, I want
Yeah.
to know what they need. But then if that's the only time they ever reach out to me,
Yeah.
well then yeah, then it feels very shallow. Whereas I've got a couple of colleagues who occasionally just reach out to say, "Hey, I was just thinking about you. How is it
Yeah.
going in your world?" And then I'm thinking, okay, well, I'll give them a quick answer, but what's the thing? Like, what do you want? And when the answer is no, no, I just wanted to
Yeah.
I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. If
Yeah.
you have some of those relationships, that tells you um, that you are more to them than just a deliverer of stuff or a deliverer of OKRs or whatever. The last point I want to make, I want to be respectful of everybody's time because, as you just heard, I'm kind of committed to starting on time and ending on time. So, um, as a leader, as a leader, there are no little lies. And I think part of what's impacting our culture, our attitudes, is we're experiencing more and more and more lies from leaders, not just business leaders, but governmental leaders, world leaders. And even in the day-to-day workplace, if you have a leader who hedges on the truth, and I realize leaders can't tell us everything. Leaders, there are things that leaders cannot share. But if you recognize that you've got a leader who tends to lie by omission, like not tell you stuff that you probably should know or would want to know, there are no little lies. And I'm not saying that a leader should never lie. I'm saying if you are a leader and you're in a situation where you can't tell the full truth, that should be a very conscious effort on your part. You should have thought it through. Am I not sharing this just because I'm uncomfortable? Because if it's just your own discomfort, then damn it, swallow it and figure it out and step into that natural tension. But if there is a actual reason why there's information that you cannot share or information that you have to share in a certain way, as long as the intent is what's best for the organization, best for the people. Like if your intent is not to make yourself comfortable, but to do what's right by the business, thinking that through, fine. We can't always be sharing every detail as a leader, but I think being sensitive to the erosion that's occurring with our employees, because what they're learning is that they can't count on leaders to tell the truth. They can't count on leaders, and we don't have time for this chat message. But I'm just finding when we go back to that when we go back to now where is it? When we go back to that research that tells us employee perceptions are drifting downward, downward, downward. I think we want to be sources of truth for our employees. And when they come to us and they ask us questions that we can't answer, it's okay to explain to them why we can't answer, but we have to be consistent sources of truth. There, I'm sorry, we're at the end of our time. We're going to have to let everybody go now, but thank you so much for staying engaged for the last 55 minutes or so.
And thanks, Dan, for giving us your time and real life stories. I hope everybody appreciated it. Thank you for engaging in the chat and just for joining. Dan is a great follow. He's also just a great mentor. If anybody is ever looking to just talk with Dan, this is what he loves to do. Really encourage you to email Dan, find him on LinkedIn, shoot him a message. Loves to just talk about this kind of stuff. So please do connect with Dan. He loves it. And with that, thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon and have a good day.
Bye now.